Hello. So last time we did very broad strokes for phase one, and we are back to do phase two, which had about the same amount of movies as phase one. So before we get into an absurd amount of movies with phase three, let's do the broad strokes. We know that the Infinity Saga has been set up and that we're going to introduce some new characters. First up, we have Iron Man 3. Now, you've probably heard a lot of bad things about this movie, and they are all true. If you need skippable projects, this is definitely one of them. That said, it does give us insight into Tony's PTSD from the Battle of New York that happened in Avengers. At the end of that movie, Tony flies a missile into an alien portal, saving the city. And that's really the only thing useful to come out of this movie is there is some character growth for Tony Stark. However, the whole setup, the villain, bleh, it's bad. And it's the first time we see Pepper in a suit because we get to see really the entirety of the Iron Legion. Basically, Tony has always been driven by fear, and after New York, he was traumatized and scared, and that led to an obsessive need to overcreate Iron Man suits. Now, I don't know exactly how many suits it was, but the point is, it was a lot. He saves Pepper, but she's put in danger by his recklessness. And you hear it a little bit later. Vision says it. Vision says it that there's a causality in there. A rise in villains happens because there are more people to challenge them. So we go to Thor: The Dark World. Two bottom tier Marvel movies in a row right here. It was pretty rough. Now, the only really relevance to this movie is the third Infinity Stone. It brings another Infinity Stone and the progression of Jane and Thor's relationship, and we all continue to love Darcy, who is Jane's research assistant and is still relevant in Phase 3. Phase 4. Yeah. Now, we have one of the best things the MCU has ever produced, and that's Captain America: Winter Soldier. Yes, I'm biased. I don't care. The audience and Steve realize that Bucky is, in fact, not dead. He was captured, tortured, and brainwashed by Hydra, the big bad Nazi agency that Steve fought in the first Captain America movie. In fact, that Steve and Bucky fought in the first Captain America movie. We're also introduced to Sam Wilson, who at this point is known as the Falcon. He's Captain America now. He's also a veteran, so he and Steve bond quickly over that. Natasha is also in this movie because apparently she's only good as an addition to someone else's story. We're all fine. We deserved a Black Widow movie back in Phase 1, but the beginning of Phase 2 wouldn't have been the end of the world either. Anyway, the things to come out of that movie is Steve starts looking for Bucky. He's aware that he is now alive, and he wants his best friend back. And he's also aware that Bucky is somewhere in there because they have a big fight. Steve falls into the water. Bucky pulls him out of the water and then storms off. So some part of his best friend is still in there. Next up, we have Guardians of the Galaxy. And the funny thing is, this is such a random introduction because the Guardians comics were never bestsellers. And for the most part, they were rather goofy. And I would say that at least James Gunn kept that energy for the films. The Guardians are misfits from across the galaxy that are all brought together because they've been thrown in prison and they decide to escape together. This is the first movie where we really start talking and treating Thanos as a threat. He becomes his own entity. He is an actual character. We find out a little bit more about Thanos in this world. This is also our introduction to the next Infinity Stone. I would also like to clear up the reason the Guardians were able to hold the stone for so long was because Peter was part Celestial, though we don't technically know that yet. It's played off as love and friendship save the galaxy. That's not real. He was part Celestial. That's why he could hold on to the stone so long. Okay. Anyway, the next film is our next Avengers outing, Age of Ultron. This movie gets a lot of criticism. some for very real, valid things, and some for absolute bullshit. Now, this movie is the introduction of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, though they kill Pietro off pretty quickly. I still hate that. Here's where we see Tony's ego. Ultron is 100%, unequivocally, Tony's fault. Wanda simply showed him his nightmare. She didn't conjure up images. She didn't get in his head and create something that wasn't there. She made him see his worst fear, just as she did with all of the Avengers when she was mind-fucking them. Tony's reaction to that was to use AI to create a weapon without talking to any of the other Avengers. Yes, he told Bruce, hey, we need this, but even Bruce was like, hey, bud, maybe we don't do this right now. But Tony wanted to use the Infinity Stone to do it, so that's what they did. Bruce gets to take 12% of the blame. The arrogance that he possesses, thinking that he is the only person that can possibly save the Earth and that no one else could have the faintest contribution to this plan, is probably what pisses people off the most. And by people, I mean people with brain cells, because there are Tony stands out there, and I don't get it. His redemption arc is still at a starting point here because he is the arrogantest piece of shit in this movie. The first criticism comes up around the internet is Natasha and Bruce being pushed into a relationship. And I think if it was set up and executed properly, it actually would have been a great pairing, but the way it was done was very forced and awkward. The other criticism it gets is that Natasha calls herself a monster because she can't have children. Now, this isn't valid for the simple fact of that's not what that line of dialogue was. It's not what it meant, not what she said. What she said was, she's a monster because she's an assassin. She's a professional murderer, and the Red Room made it easier for her to be a professional murderer by sterilizing her so she wouldn't have anything else in her life to worry about except the mission. That was the line of dialogue. That's what that meant. Her not having a family, that not even being an option for her, made it so that she could focus wholeheartedly on her mission, and her mission was to murder people. That's what made her the monster, not the fact that she couldn't have kids. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. The movie set up the Black Panther by mentioning Wakanda and vibranium. It sets up the Infinity Saga by having Thor go on his own mission to find out about the Infinity Stones. It sets up Civil War because, once again, Tony and Steve are at odds because they aren't friends. They are colleagues at best. And because of Tony's arrogance. And it gives us Wanda. And you really only see... God, you only see, like, the slightest fraction of her powers in this movie. But we see now that it had so much more to go. Next up, we have another addition to the MCU characters with the release of Ant-Man. Honestly, you can really skip all the origin stories. Scott is a convict, tries to rob Pym, who in turn catches him and turns him into the next generation of Ant-Man, because if you read comic books, Hank Pym is Ant-Man. We're also introduced to Hope Van Dyne, who ends up being Scott's love interest and the next generation of Wasp. Where we stand now, even more tension exists between Steve and Tony, even though they made amends. Hawkeye has basically adopted Wanda as his new little superhero baby. Steve and Natasha are training the new Avengers, Wanda and Sam specifically. Vision now, because we have Vision. Bruce flew off by himself at the end of Age of Ultron, and we don't know where he went. And we have a new superhero and a new superhero team. As always, feel free to ask questions, and I will be happy to answer them. Of this phase, the ones I recommend are really just Winter Soldier and Age of Ultron. As a Wanda lover, I cannot allow people to skip her introduction. But yeah, thanks, guys.